In 1984, the popular band Metallica released a song called Fade to Black. They sing, "Life, it seems, will fade away, drifting further every day, getting lost within myself. Nothing matters, no one else. I have lost the will to live, simply nothing more to give. There is nothing more for me, need the end to set me free." In this song, Metallica perfectly captures what many people feel when life fails to go as planned. Hopelessness and despair, loss of a will to live, feelings of uselessness. And as this song says, many people see the end of life as the only escape, the only way to be free from the agony of life. In all this despair, euthanasia can often seem the easiest and quickest escape. However, because every human life is created in God's image, taking one of these lives through euthanasia is immoral. So we must fight against euthanasia and spread awareness about the value of human life. Before I can unpack all the reasons to oppose euthanasia, I must first define what I mean when I say euthanasia. According to Professor Kalavani Anadurai, the word euthanasia is derived from Greek, eu meaning good and thanatos meaning death. Put together, it means good death. Furthermore, she clarifies euthanasia as the hastening of death of a patient to prevent further sufferings. At present, there are two main ways this can happen, through active and through passive euthanasia. Funk and Wagnall's New World Encyclopedia defines active euthanasia as a deliberate action by a physician who administers a lethal dose of a drug to end a person's life, while passive euthanasia can be defined as termination of life-sustaining treatment. For example, pulling the plug on a dying patient's life support. In my speech, I will only be addressing active euthanasia, which I will simply define as the deliberate ending of a patient's life to prevent further suffering. Next, we must consider the current laws and regulations on euthanasia in the United States. According to Alex Schadenberg, the executive director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, there is no federal law governing physician-assisted suicide. Therefore, individual states are allowed to determine their own legal stance. Currently, 13 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have legalized euthanasia for those with a terminal illness and a life expectancy of 6 months or less. However, these laws are beginning to stretch. Certain jurisdictions have broader eligibility criteria, such as psychiatric disorders, which can include things such as depression, feeling a burden, fearing a loss of control or dignity, or a dislike of being dependent. While the states which allow euthanasia claim its use only for suffering and dying patients, these laws are beginning to stretch, allowing euthanasia for people with various mental struggles as well. And not only have the states broadened their requirements, but 2 states have removed their residency requirement, effectively opening the practice of physician-assisted suicide more broadly to patients throughout the United States. Thus, anyone in the United States with a terminal illness or perhaps even a mental struggle can request to have their own life taken away through euthanasia. Today, I will first examine what God says about euthanasia, the abuses in euthanasia, and its impact on family and friends. I will next refute arguments claiming that withholding euthanasia is cruel and heartless. And lastly, I will explore what we can do about euthanasia as the church and as individuals. So first, what does God say about euthanasia? Well, because euthanasia dishonors and disobeys God's clear commands in His Word, the Bible, we can see that we must fight against it, eliminating this wicked practice from our society. First, euthanasia opposes God's plan because God made us as His image bearers, and ending a life with physician-assisted suicide erases one of these precious images of God. In the beginning of the Bible, we see that God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. When man was first created, he was set apart from the rest of creation because he was made different. He was made in God's image. As image bearers of God, we are called to reflect God's characteristics and attributes. However, the early ending of a life does not reflect God's characteristics, but rather destroys one of His special and uniquely created images, deeply offending and sinning against God, our Creator. However, God not only created man in His own image, but He has made all those who trust in Him holy temples, temples which the Apostle Paul says God protects and values greatly. In his letter to the Corinthians, Paul questions, "Do you not know that you are a temple of the Holy God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are." All believers have become the new temples of God, in which His Spirit dwells. And Paul tells us that by destroying God's holy temple, as euthanasia does, we will incur God's wrath, demonstrating His deep hatred for the ending of human life. God values and loves and protects every one of His images, His temples, His children. Euthanasia also goes against God by undermining the plans of the sovereign creator of our own universe. King Solomon reminds us that no man has authority to restrain the wind with wind, or authority over the day of death. Award-winning Catholic author, journalist, and speaker Patty Armstrong also adds that rejecting God's authority is rejecting God. God has a plan for our life, right up until the end. King Solomon, the wisest of all men, pointed out that man is not powerful, is not in control, is not sovereign. God is. The creator, not the created, should decide the days we live and the day we die. And as Patty Armstrong reminds us, by going against God's sovereign plans, we're going against him. Euthanasia directly defies God's plans for our lives and for our deaths, and directly defies God himself. In addition, in Proverbs, King Solomon informs us that euthanasia is an abomination in God's eyes, and he hates it. Solomon says that there are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood are 3 of these. Physician-assisted suicide may seem compassionate and merciful, but deep down it is the shedding of innocent blood, one of the top 7 things that God says he despises. As our Creator and Savior, God deserves our respect, our obedience, our honor. By condoning euthanasia, we fight against our Creator and King. We destroy his images and holy temples. We ignore his sovereignty. We go directly against his plan. God hates early deaths through euthanasia, so we also must despise and avoid and fight against it. However, not only does God say euthanasia is wrong, but even from a secular worldview, we still have a moral obligation to fight euthanasia because of the abuses which often hide behind the decision to die. One of these abuses occurs when people in a hard place in life are encouraged to end their own lives because others are not willing to help bear their burdens. Johnny Erickson Tada, who was paralyzed as a teen and survived cancer later in life, expresses that vulnerable people, such as the poor, the senile, and those uninsured, are being pressured into euthanizing themselves in order to relieve the economic burden they place on society. As a vulnerable person herself, Tada warns that when someone is less able to help advance society, those around them may use euthanasia as a way to eliminate them and the burden they present, rather than coming alongside with compassion and care. This dark practice reveals the selfishness and abuse in the human heart that legalized euthanasia can easily draw out. One example of this abuse was a man named George Gallegos, who was diagnosed with ALS. Throughout his struggles, he constantly considered euthanasia, not sure where to draw the line. Was when he could no longer breathe or eat on his own, or when he felt he'd become too much of a burden to his family. Gallegos did pass away before choosing euthanasia. However, throughout the years of his battle, the thought of being a burden to his family was constantly on his mind, and a reason he kept deliberating whether or not to have his own life taken away from him. But worries of being a burden to family or friends should never be a reason for the elderly or ill to fear, because God commands us to bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. If we obey God's law, we care for our struggling family and friends, removing the fear from their hearts by joyfully coming alongside them in their struggles. Another facet of the abuse in euthanasia can be seen when lethal drugs legalized only for terminally ill and dying patients are administered to patients who actually have many more years to live. Sometimes patients can be given lethal drugs when they're not even dying, and records say that diabetes has even been an accepted reason to receive euthanasia. While the laws in the United States allow lethal drugs only for those who are terminally ill and in the last months of life, this definition is often stretched, leading to the early deaths of people who may have lived for many more years. Additionally, even when the doctor determines how much time somebody has left to live, these predictions are not always accurate, again opening the door to physician-assisted suicide of patients who may have lived for longer. A major study of physician prognoses in Chicago revealed that of 468 predictions, only 20% were even accurate in predicting when death would occur. Even when the doctor predicts death is close, they're not always accurate. People may be told they have only months left and may turn to physician-assisted suicide, not knowing that they could actually have lived for many more years. However, not only are patients ending their own lives due to inaccurate information, but in some cases, elderly people can be euthanized without even consenting due to the loose restrictions on lethal drugs. Because patients are allowed to take the lethal drugs without a doctor present, heirs or malicious caretakers can easily pressure a patient or even give them the deadly prescription without asking due to the loose restrictions on lethal drugs. For example, in 2001, Dr. Wilfred Van Ogen was found guilty of euthanizing a dying 84-year-old woman without her permission, but was found innocent by court because he was acting upon what he thought was best for her. Because of these relaxed rules surrounding the administration of lethal drugs, patients such as this woman can be killed without consent or even knowledge at times. This type of behavior can no longer go unchecked under the guise of a merciful removal of suffering. It can only be classified as murder. We cannot allow this blatant sin to remain in the dark. We must fight against the murder of innocent patients and bring the corruption of euthanasia into the light for all to see. Not only is euthanasia wrong, though, because of the many ways it is abused, but also because it deeply affects the family and friends of the one who chooses death, revealing the selfishness ingrained in the decision to die. First and most importantly, when a patient chooses physician-assisted suicide, it can deeply hurt those nearest to them, such as family or close friends. Let me give you two real-life examples of times this has happened. In March of 2026, just earlier this year, Noelia Castillo Ramos chose euthanasia after a prior suicide attempt left her paralyzed and in chronic pain. Her father, however, deeply opposed this decision and had been in court for years trying to fight her decision. By choosing the easy route out, Ramos deeply grieved and hurt her father, who wanted her to live and had invested years of his time and effort into trying to help her. Another instance of euthanasia hurting family members happened back in 2017, when Miriam Michelle, mother of filmmaker Serene Michelle Dillman, chose to end her own life using physician-assisted suicide after being diagnosed with a terminal illness. After Miriam made this choice, her husband and Michelle Dillman's father felt anger and hurt over not having a say or being a part of that decision of having to watch his own wife die. Miriam chose euthanasia, not consulting her husband or giving him a say. So when she died, he was left alone, hurt by her abandoning him without even asking his thoughts. Miriam chose the easy route for herself, but she failed to consider or care about how those around her would feel. Furthermore, while the death of a loved one might appear to hurt initially but heal with time, this hurt actually often runs much deeper, affecting loved ones for the rest of their lives. Michelle Dillman recalls that her father was so lost, he would isolate himself, never go out, and he basically cut off any close relationships he had. Something in him died as well, and we couldn't seem to find it again. Robert Michelle's hurt was not just short-term. His wife's decision to die changed him forever. Her one simple decision deeply affected Robert and all those who knew him as they watched him suffer, isolate himself, cut off all relationships. However, emotional and mental pain are not the only side effects. The decision to euthanize yourself can also lead others to make similar decisions, again revealing the thoughtlessness of the choice to die. A few years after Miriam Michelle chose euthanasia, her husband Robert was also diagnosed with a terminal illness and quickly followed the same route as his wife. Michelle Dillman recalls her father's decision, saying he could have helped himself and lived longer, I believe. I really feel like mentally, my mom's death is what killed him. I don't even think it was the diagnosis. I think the diagnosis was an excuse for him. Oh, this is what I can use to get the heck out of here. Since his wife died, Robert was never the same. He had died inside, lost all hope, all meaning and reason for life. As soon as he was legally able to due to his own illness, he took the same route as his wife, euthanizing himself to end the pain caused by her intentional passing. Her decision may have seemed like a good choice at the time, an easy way out of the pain and suffering and lack of control. But deep down, the decision to die is a self-centered and thoughtless decision. Your decision to give up and take the easy way out affects those close to you, changing them forever. While the choice to die does have the deepest effect on those close to you, a wider array of other people intertwined in your life are also hurt, once again revealing how unloving and inconsiderate this choice truly is. Johnny Erickson Tada warns that a decision to cut short life, even if only a few months, does not stop with those I love, but affects a whole network of relationships. Friends, former colleagues, teachers, distant family members, casual acquaintances, and even nurses and doctors who occasionally stop by your bedside. Choosing euthanasia hurts all these people who may not have even been considered. Your seemingly simple and selfless act suddenly changes so many lives, the lives of all who knew you and who cared about you. The truth about euthanasia cannot be hidden any longer. This is no quiet and simple escape. It is a self-centered and thoughtless and sinful act, one we must fight back against, one we must not let ourselves be fooled by. Despite all these arguments, many people may still question, isn't leaving someone to suffer by disallowing euthanasia cruel and thus sinful? Or isn't it better to let someone die with dignity rather than succumbing to a disease? In reality, suffering is part of God's plan for creation. God allows suffering for our own good, not to harm us permanently. James says to consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. God allows suffering and pain in our lives to test our faith and bring about endurance. So letting someone suffer is not cruel, but rather allows God's plan for them to unfold as he intended. Furthermore, the sufferings of this earth are only temporary. Paul says that he considers that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. God allows suffering to test our faith, but if we stand strong, he will reveal his glory to us one day, a reward far greater than the trials we face on earth. By choosing euthanasia, we take the less honorable route by trying to escape and skip God's plans rather than trusting him through the difficulties. By choosing to live, we die with more dignity by taking the path intended by our Creator. In addition, modern medicine has advanced to the point that patients rarely even experience pain that cannot be treated, proving euthanasia unnecessary once again. For my speech, I had the honor of interviewing pediatric ICU medical director John Witt, who's been a doctor for 20 years. Dr. Witt claims that with a good physician, it is very rare that there be a time that there is pain and suffering from cancer or heart failure or whatever the condition may be that our current medical abilities couldn't control and take care of. He says that you could have one of the worst tumors and some of the worst things, but we have really good pain medicines that when given can relieve very serious pain and very serious suffering. Suffering and pain are no longer even a concern, further debunking the idea that somebody may need to choose euthanasia to avoid the agony of disease or death. But what can we do about euthanasia? How can we help to save lives? First, the church must equip Christians to go into the world and make a difference, and then they must go out and do so. First, the church must teach Christians why life is important so that they can share this knowledge and help those around them. Dr. Witt says that the church needs to make sure we do a good job teaching what it means to be a human, what it means to be an image bearer of God, what that dignity comes from. Our dignity is not something we have on our own, it's something that is given to us. Before we can effectively oppose euthanasia, we must understand why it is wrong and what God says about it. This is where the church must step in, teaching why man is important and why life is valuable. How can we fight euthanasia if we do not properly value human life as God does? Another aspect that the church must teach is the sovereignty of God in all things, including life, suffering, death. Dr. Witt says that Christians must also understand God's plan and God's goodness in our suffering, because we do know that God uses all things for our good. Before we can be fully equipped to face issues such as euthanasia, we must first understand the value of human life and God's plan in our suffering. We will suffer. There is no doubt in that. But God tells us that if we belong to him, all of our suffering is for his glory and for our good. Without a good understanding and theology of suffering, we'll be unable to go through our own trials without giving up and choosing early intentional death ourselves. However, once we understand the value of human life and the purpose of suffering, we must then turn around and use this knowledge to help those around us who are struggling with a desire to end their own lives. One of the main ways we can do this is through end-of-life programs. So in whatever ways possible, we must work to improve our end-of-life programs, including increasing the availability and the knowledge of these alternatives. Once people know they have another way out, they may be willing to choose end-of-life care over euthanasia, both honoring their family and friends and respecting and honoring God. Perhaps some people here will study to be doctors or nurses or some other position which allows them to directly influence the spread of end-of-life care. But even if not, every single one of us has the ability to help. Maybe you know somebody who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness and has been considering euthanasia. Even if you're not a doctor, you can still inform them of the other options, such as end-of-life care. You can still plead with them to make a different decision. You can still help them to change their mind. Maybe you know somebody who is struggling mentally and feels ready to give up. Just a few encouraging words to them might just brighten their day, change their view on life, and awaken once again a desire to live. Just a few words to a struggling or ill person can save a life. Don't be shy. Don't let suffering people fade to black. Stand up for and protect life. Thank you.